What would you do if you discovered that the church where your family has worshipped for generations was built upon a foundation of unspeakable evil? Would you reveal the truth, knowing it could destroy your community's faith, or would you become yet another keeper of secrets? In the stifling heat of a Mississippi summer in the year 1900, as the new century was just beginning to unfold its promises and perils, the small town of Covington's Hollow was about to confront a darkness that had been festering beneath its pious exterior for decades. What began as routine renovation work on the town's oldest church would unearth a horror so profound that many locals would later claim the discovery was divine intervention, God's judgment finally revealing sins long hidden from the light of day. The Covington's Hollow First Baptist Church stood as the crown jewel of the small logging town, its white wooden spire visible from every corner of the valley. Built in 1865, immediately following the Civil War, the church had been a symbol of renewal and community healing. For 35 years it had hosted weddings, funerals, baptisms, and weekly services without interruption. The church ledgers, meticulously maintained by a succession of devoted deacons, showed not a single Sunday missed, a point of pride for Reverend Thaddeus Blackwood, who had served as pastor for the last 22 years. "The church is God's house on earth," Reverend Blackwood often proclaimed from his pulpit. "And in Covington's Hollow we keep God's house in order." These words would take on a macabre new meaning in the sweltering August of 1900, when a series of events began that would expose the true nature of Covington's Hollow and its most respected citizens. According to the county records preserved now in the Mississippi State Archives, the renovation project that led to the discovery was approved on August 3, 1900. The church's western wall had begun to show signs of water damage following an unusually wet spring, and the church board had unanimously voted to allocate funds for repairs before the damage could spread to the main sanctuary. The contract for the work went to Samuel Tucker, a carpenter who had recently relocated to Covington's Hollow from Natchez with his wife and young daughter. Tucker was not yet fully embraced by the tight-knit community, which tended to view outsiders with lingering suspicion, but his rates were competitive, and his reputation as a skilled craftsman had preceded him. The first oddity, though it seemed minor at the time, occurred on the morning of August 7th when Tucker and his two-man crew began removing the damaged wooden panels from the church's exterior western wall. According to Tucker's later statement to the county sheriff, they noticed an unusual feature in the construction. The western wall was different from the others, Tucker wrote in his sworn affidavit. Now housed in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, it was like they'd built a wall in front of another wall. Didn't make no sense from a construction standpoint. I figured maybe they'd reinforced it later, but the inner wall looked older, not newer. This curious architectural anomaly might have been dismissed as a quirk of 19th century building practices had Tucker not also noticed something else, a faint, sickly sweet odor emanating from the space between the walls. He initially attributed this to dead rodents, or perhaps a raccoon that had become trapped and perished there. Such occurrences were common enough in older buildings, particularly in rural Mississippi, where the humid climate accelerated decomposition. Tucker's assistant, James Fowler, a local boy of 19, later told investigators, "Mr. Tucker told us to break through that inner wall to see what kind of critter had died in there. He gave me the sledgehammer, and I swung it hard against the boards. The wood was old but still solid. It took 3 good hits before it splintered. That's when the smell hit us proper. Wasn't like any dead animal I ever smelled before. It was worse, but also different somehow. The men knocked a hole approximately 2 feet square into the inner wall. As dust and splinters settled, Tucker lit a lantern and peered into the darkness beyond. What he saw in those first moments would haunt him for the remainder of his life. There was a space, his affidavit continues, a narrow room or corridor running between the western wall and what looked to be the original exterior of the church. And there were remains, human remains, small ones. I knew right away they were children. Tucker immediately ordered his crew to stop work and sent Fowler to fetch Sheriff Elias Montgomery. The discovery of what appeared to be multiple sets of human remains, initially estimated at 3 to 5, hidden within the church walls, was met with shock and disbelief by the local authorities. Sheriff Montgomery's initial report, dated August 7, 1900, notes his skepticism. Arrived at First Baptist Church at approximately 10:35 in the morning, responding to reports of human remains discovered during renovation work. Upon inspection, confirmed presence of what appear to be skeletal remains of at least 3 individuals of small stature, likely juvenile. Age of remains difficult to determine, but appears considerable. Have secured the site and dispatched Deputy Collins to Oxford to telegraph the state authorities for assistance. News of the grisly discovery spread through Covington's Hollow like wildfire. By noon, a crowd had gathered outside the church, held back by a hastily erected rope cordon and the stern presence of Deputy Walter Collins, who had returned from dispatching the telegram. Reverend Blackwood arrived shortly thereafter, his normally composed demeanor visibly shaken. According to multiple witness statements, Blackwood's first reaction upon being informed of the discovery was to deny its possibility outright. "There must be some mistake," he was heard insisting to Sheriff Montgomery. "Perhaps they're animal bones, or Indian remains from before the town was settled," but there was no mistake. As the opening in the wall was carefully widened under the sheriff's supervision, the horrific extent of the discovery began to emerge. The space between the walls ran the entire length of the western side of the church, approximately 60 feet, and varied in width from 3 to 5 feet, ample room for a person to navigate. And within this hidden corridor, investigators would ultimately document the remains of 17 children. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the county physician who was called to the scene late that afternoon, provided the first medical assessment. The remains appear to be those of children ranging in approximate age from 4 to 12 years. Due to the advanced state of decomposition and the dry conditions within the wall cavity, precise dating is challenging, but I estimate the deaths occurred over a period of several years, possibly extending back 2 decades or more. As twilight descended on that first day, Sheriff Montgomery made the decision to post deputies at the church overnight and continue the investigation in the morning. No one yet understood the true scope of what had been uncovered, nor how deeply it would implicate the town's most prominent citizens. The following day, August 8th, brought state investigators from Jackson, led by Special Investigator Harlan Reeves of the newly formed Mississippi Bureau of Investigation. Reeves, a former Pinkerton detective with experience in complex cases, would later become famous for his methodical dismantling of the Covington's Hollow conspiracy. His field journals, donated to the state archives by his daughter in 1958, provide the most comprehensive contemporaneous account of the investigation. "Upon arrival at the scene," Reeves wrote in his first entry, "it was immediately apparent that we were dealing with a crime of extraordinary magnitude and malice. The concealed space behind the church wall had been purpose-built, with evidence of careful planning. Cross beams had been repositioned to create the cavity while maintaining structural integrity. The exterior wall had been constructed with a hidden access point, cleverly disguised as a storage cabinet in the church's rear vestibule, though this entrance had been subsequently sealed with additional boards and plaster. Reeves's initial examination confirmed Dr. Whitfield's assessment regarding the number and approximate ages of the victims. However, he made several additional observations that would prove crucial to understanding the case. Many of the skeletal remains show evidence of binding at the wrists and ankles. Hemp fiber fragments still adhere to some of the bones. More disturbing are the marks visible on several of the skulls, evidence of blunt force trauma that likely caused or contributed to death. By midday on August 8th, the investigation had expanded beyond the church itself. Reeves established a temporary headquarters in the sheriff's office and began the painstaking process of identifying the victims, a challenging task given the condition of the remains and the apparent time span over which the deaths had occurred. His first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. As word of the discovery spread to neighboring communities, a woman named Eleanor Jessup arrived from Millfield, a small settlement 20 miles east of Covington's Hollow. Mrs. Jessup, a widow in her 50s, came with a specific purpose. She believed her daughter Sarah, who had disappeared in 1887 while traveling through Covington's Hollow, might be among the victims. Reeves's interview with Mrs. Jessup, transcribed by his assistant, offers the first glimpse into a pattern that would soon become horrifyingly clear. Mrs. Jessup reports that her daughter, aged 9 at the time of her disappearance, was traveling with her father, who had business in Covington's Hollow. Mr. Jessup returned alone, claiming the child had fallen ill and been taken in by a local family to recover, with arrangements made for her return once well. When Sarah never returned, Mr. Jessup went back to Covington's Hollow to investigate, but was reportedly told the family had moved on, taking the girl with them, as she had become attached to their own children. Mr. Jessup accepted this explanation at the time, though Mrs. Jessup remained suspicious. Mr. Jessup passed away in 1893, never knowing what truly became of his daughter. Mrs. Jessup provided a small personal effect, a distinctive silver hair clasp that she said had belonged to Sarah. Remarkably, among the items recovered from the hidden chamber was a nearly identical clasp, tarnished but recognizable. This potential match represented the first tentative identification of a victim. Over the next several days, as news of the investigation spread through surrounding counties, more families came forward with stories of children who had gone missing in or near Covington's Hollow over the years. A pattern began to emerge. Most of the missing children had been travelers passing through the town, often with parents or guardians who were subsequently given plausible explanations for their disappearances. The investigation took a significant turn on August 11th, when Reeves, acting on information from county records, ordered the excavation of a section of the church basement directly beneath the western wall. County tax records indicated that in 1878, the church had been granted a permit for basement expansion, supposedly to create additional storage and Sunday school space. However, no corresponding records existed in the church's own meticulously kept ledgers of improvements and modifications. The basement excavation revealed a second chamber, smaller than the one in the wall but similarly concealed. Here, investigators discovered something that shifted the case from mere murder to something far more sinister: ritual implements. These included an altar-like stone slab with drainage channels carved into its surface, various metal instruments whose purpose could only be guessed at, and most disturbingly, leather-bound ledgers containing entries that appeared to document ceremonies or rituals spanning from 1870 through 1895. The contents of these ledgers, Reeves wrote, suggest organized activities of a depraved nature involving multiple participants over many years. While much of the text is written in a cipher or code that we have yet to decipher fully, certain passages are clear enough. They reference the great work and necessary sacrifices, and include what appear to be dates corresponding to religious or astronomical events. The discovery of this ritual chamber fundamentally altered the direction of the investigation. It was no longer a question of who had killed these children and hidden their bodies, but rather what organized group had been operating within the church, apparently for decades, committing atrocities under the guise of religious practice. Attention increasingly focused on the church leadership, including Reverend Blackwood, who had been pastor since 1878, and the church board of deacons. Most had been prominent citizens of Covington's Hollow for generations, their families among the town's founders. Reeves noted in his journal, "The involvement of the church leadership seems inevitable given the location and duration of these activities. Such operations could not have been conducted without their knowledge and most likely their active participation. What remains unclear is the extent of this conspiracy, whether it was confined to the church leadership or extended to other prominent citizens or institutions within the town." On August 14th, a week after the initial discovery, Reeves made the decision to arrest Reverend Blackwood and 3 church deacons: Harold Covington, a direct descendant of the town's founder, George Sullivan and William Porter. The arrests sent shockwaves through the community, with many residents refusing to believe that these respected men could be involved in such unspeakable crimes. The day following the arrests, an incident occurred that suggested the conspiracy might indeed extend beyond the church leadership. Deputy Walter Collins, who had been among the first law enforcement officers at the scene, failed to report for his morning shift. When Sheriff Montgomery went to Collins's home to check on him, he found the deputy dead, an apparent suicide by hanging. A note supposedly written by Collins claimed responsibility for the deaths of the children, insisting that the arrested men were innocent and that he had acted alone. Reeves immediately suspected foul play. "The notion that Collins acted alone is absurd on its face," he wrote. "The physical evidence clearly indicates activities spanning decades, well before Collins was even an adult. Furthermore, the supposed suicide note contains information about the case that had not been made public, and that Collins, who had limited involvement in the investigation, could not have known. This bears all the hallmarks of a desperate attempt to end the investigation by providing a convenient scapegoat. The investigation pressed forward despite this setback. Forensic examination of the remains continued, with Dr. Whitfield working alongside a specialist from Jackson to determine causes of death and approximate timeframes. Their preliminary findings, submitted on August 16th, painted a grim picture. Analysis of the 17 sets of remains indicates varied causes of death, though certain patterns are evident. 11 show signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. 6 exhibit cut marks on cervical vertebrae, consistent with throat slitting. All 17 show evidence of restraint at time of death, and at least 9 show signs of extended malnutrition prior to death, suggesting they may have been held captive for some period. Even more disturbing was the ritualistic nature evident in some of the deaths. Dr. Whitfield's report noted, "In 6 cases, there are distinctive marks on the ribs consistent with structured, deliberate incisions rather than wounds inflicted in the heat of violence. These appear to have been made with precision, possibly while the victims were still alive, suggesting ritualistic intent rather than mere murder." Meanwhile, Reeves and his team continued their efforts to decipher the coded ledgers found in the basement chamber. Progress was slow, but by August 20th, they had managed to translate portions, revealing a belief system that blended corrupted Christian doctrine with older, pagan elements and what appeared to be entirely fabricated mystical concepts. The texts refer repeatedly to the Ascension, apparently a state of being or enlightenment that the perpetrators believed could be achieved through these rituals, Reeves documented. There are references to the vessel children, whose innocent essence was somehow necessary for this transformation. The doctrine, such as it is, appears to have been developed or at least formalized by someone identified only as the Prophet, whose identity remains unclear. As the investigation entered its 3rd week, the case took yet another turn when Reeves received a visitor at his temporary office. Mary Porter, wife of William Porter, one of the arrested deacons. Mrs. Porter, clearly terrified but determined, brought with her a small diary that she claimed belonged to her husband, discovered hidden beneath a floorboard in their home. "I should have come forward sooner," Mrs. Porter told Reeves according to his transcribed interview. "But I was afraid. Everyone in town knows not to speak against the church leadership. Bad things happen to those who do." The diary proved to be a significant piece of evidence, as it contained entries dating back to 1876, when Porter had first joined what he referred to as the inner circle. While careful never to explicitly detail criminal acts, the diary nonetheless painted a picture of a secretive group operating within the church, led initially by someone referred to only as DC, believed to be Daniel Covington, Harold's father and the church's pastor, until his death in 1878, after which Blackwood assumed leadership. Porter's diary entries became increasingly disturbed over the years, suggesting a man increasingly troubled by his involvement, yet unable or unwilling to break away. April 10, 1889, another ceremony tonight. I prayed for strength, but participated nonetheless. The prophet says the great work requires sacrifice, that we are building something that will transcend time. I try to believe, but the doubts grow stronger with each passing year. A later entry from 1895 was even more revealing. November 1st, 1895, Blackwood says the final phase approaches. The vessel preparations have intensified. 7 now reside in the chambers. When I expressed concern about the risks of discovery, H.C. reminded me of my oath and what befell Jenkins when he wavered. I will not share his fate. This reference to Jenkins led investigators to examine the town's death records, where they discovered that Robert Jenkins, a former church deacon, had died in 1892, supposedly from a fall from his horse. His widow had left town shortly thereafter. By the end of August, the investigation had uncovered evidence implicating not just the church leadership, but several other prominent citizens, including Judge Ephraim Wallace, who had presided over the county court for 15 years. Dr. Richard Holcomb, one of only 2 physicians in the area, and most shockingly, Sheriff Montgomery himself, whose complicity explained how the disappearances had gone uninvestigated for so long. Montgomery's involvement came to light through an unexpected source, his own deputy, Frank Miller, who came forward after finding incriminating documents in the sheriff's desk while acting as interim sheriff following Montgomery's convenient departure. On urgent family business the day after the arrests of Blackwood and the Deacons, "I never wanted to believe the sheriff could be involved in something like this," Deputy Miller told Reeves. "But the evidence is clear. He's been protecting them for years, redirecting investigations, discouraging missing persons reports. There's a letter here from Blackwood thanking him for his discretion regarding the unfortunate incident with the Williams boy in 1892. That would be Timmy Williams, who supposedly drowned in the creek, though his body was never found. With this new information, state authorities expanded the investigation and arrests. Judge Wallace was apprehended attempting to flee to Louisiana. Dr. Holcomb was found dead in his office, having apparently taken a lethal dose of morphine upon learning of Wallace's arrest. Sheriff Montgomery remained at large, though reports placed him heading west toward the Mississippi River. The case against the conspirators was built methodically over the following months. Of the 17 victims, investigators eventually identified 11, mainly through personal effects found with the remains or distinctive physical characteristics noted in missing persons reports from surrounding counties. The trial of what newspapers across the South soon dubbed the Covington's Hollow Devil Cult began in January 1901 in Oxford, the venue having been changed due to concerns about the impossibility of an impartial jury in Covington's Hollow itself. The proceedings captivated the nation, with newspapers as far away as New York and Chicago sending correspondents to cover what was described as the most shocking case of ritualistic murder in American history. The prosecution, led by State Attorney William Harrison, presented a case that detailed decades of abductions, killings, and occult rituals. The motive, as pieced together from the decoded ledgers, Porter's diary, and testimony from Mary Porter and others who had peripheral knowledge of the group's activities, centered on the cult's belief that through specific ritualistic sacrifices of innocent vessels, children, the participants could achieve a state of transcendence they called the Ascension. According to the decoded texts, this belief system had been developed by Daniel Covington in the years following the Civil War. Drawing on various esoteric traditions he had encountered during his extensive travels before settling in Mississippi, combined with his own disturbed interpretations of biblical prophecy. The most damning testimony came from William Porter himself, who, in exchange for being spared the death penalty, provided a full account of the group's activities. His testimony, given over 6 consecutive days, detailed how children, primarily those passing through town with families who would not remain long enough to conduct thorough searches when they went missing, were selected, abducted, and held in the hidden chambers within the church before being used in rituals timed to specific celestial events or religious holidays. The children were told they had been chosen for a special blessing, Porter testified according to court transcripts. At first they were treated well, given sweets and toys, but as the designated ceremony approached, they were isolated, deprived of food, and subjected to what Blackwood called purification, which meant beatings with specific implements believed to drive out impurities. The actual ceremonies usually took place at midnight. The child would be brought to the basement chamber, secured to the altar, and the ritual performed according to specific instructions from the texts Covington had compiled. Porter's testimony also revealed the cult's ultimate goal. Blackwood believed that once a sufficient number of ceremonies had been completed, he spoke of 49 souls being the necessary total, a final grand ritual would enable all participants to achieve the ascension, transcending their physical forms and becoming something beyond human. This final ceremony was to take place at the dawn of the new century. This explained the acceleration in abductions and killings noted in the final years before discovery. With 6 of the 17 victims estimated to have been killed in 1899 alone. The cult had been working toward their grand culmination, planned for midnight on December 31st, 1899. What had prevented this final ceremony remained unclear until nearly the end of the trial, when a surprise witness was called, Thomas Blackwood, the 26-year-old son of Reverend Blackwood, who had been estranged from his father for several years and was living in Memphis. Thomas Blackwood's testimony provided the missing piece. "I grew up witnessing strange gatherings at our home, midnight meetings in the church when it should have been empty. Father would speak of the great work, but never explained what this meant. As I grew older, I began to suspect something terrible was happening. In 1898, I confronted him after overhearing a conversation about preparing the next vessel. His response chilled me to the bone. He didn't deny anything but told me I would understand someday, that I was of the blood and would eventually take my place in the inner circle." Thomas continued, "I fled to Memphis that night and tried to build a new life, but the guilt of what I suspected haunted me. In December 1899, I returned to Covington's Hollow, determined to find evidence and alert authorities. On the night of December 30th, I broke into the church through a window intending to search for proof. I found the hidden door to the basement chamber partially open. Inside, I discovered a child, a boy of about 7, bound and drugged but still alive. I freed him and fled with him to Millfield, where I entrusted him to the care of a doctor I knew wouldn't ask too many questions, then continued on to Jackson, intending to speak with state authorities. But," Thomas concluded, his voice breaking, "my courage failed me. I convinced myself I had imagined things, or at least exaggerated them. I returned to Memphis and tried to forget. When I read about the discoveries at the church 7 months later, I knew I could no longer remain silent. The child Thomas had rescued was eventually identified as Peter Collins, who had been reported missing from a neighboring county 2 weeks before Thomas's intervention. The boy had no memory of his captivity due to the drugs he'd been given, and the doctor in Millfield had assumed he was a runaway. This unexpected rescue had thrown the cult's carefully planned grand culmination into disarray, forcing them to postpone their final ceremony and likely setting the stage for the eventual discovery of their crimes. The trial concluded in March 1901 with guilty verdicts for all defendants. Reverend Blackwood, Harold Covington, and George Sullivan were sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence carried out on April 12th of that year. William Porter, due to his cooperation, received life imprisonment, as did Judge Wallace. Sheriff Montgomery was eventually captured in Texas and returned to Mississippi for trial, where he too received the death penalty, carried out in June. The aftermath of the case transformed Covington's Hollow. Many families fled, unable to continue living in a place now synonymous with such horror. The church was demolished by order of the state, the land upon which it stood declared unsuitable for future development. Today, more than 100 years later, that plot remains empty, overgrown with wild vegetation, a silent testament to the evil once harbored there. Yet questions remain. The full extent of the cult's activities was never conclusively determined. The 17 victims discovered represent only those whose remains were hidden within the church walls. Given the cult's decades of operation and the references in their texts to 49 souls, it seems likely that other victims may lie undiscovered elsewhere. More troubling are the indications that the Covington's Hollow group may not have been operating in isolation. References in the coded ledgers to sister circles in Louisiana, Alabama, and as far north as Illinois suggest a wider network of similar cults. Special Investigator Reeves spent the remainder of his career investigating these connections, though with limited success. In his final report before retirement in 1922, Reeves wrote words that continue to disturb researchers to this day. While the primary perpetrators of the Covington's Hollow atrocities have met justice, I remain convinced that their work was part of a larger design whose full scope we have yet to comprehend. The references to a great work that continues beyond any single circle suggest an overarching purpose that transcends the individuals we brought to justice. It is my fervent hope that this larger conspiracy, if it exists, will one day be exposed and eradicated. Until then, we must remain vigilant, for evil of this magnitude rarely confines itself to a single manifestation. Indeed, in the decades following the Covington's Hollow case, similar discoveries, hidden chambers, ritualistic implements, and in some cases human remains, have been made in churches and other buildings across the southern United States. Whether these represent independent occurrences or evidence of the sister circles mentioned in the Covington's Hollow texts remains a matter of debate among criminologists and historians. The most recent such discovery occurred in 1973 in a small Louisiana town, where renovation work on a 19th-century courthouse revealed a sealed room containing artifacts bearing striking similarities to those found in Covington's Hollow, including texts referencing the Ascension and the Great Work. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the fate of the coded ledgers and ritual texts recovered from the Covington's Hollow Church. Held as evidence during the trial, these materials were supposedly destroyed by court order following the executions. However, a fire at the Oxford Courthouse in 1910 destroyed many records from the case, and subsequent inventories of the evidence revealed that several of the texts were missing, their whereabouts unknown. In the decades since, rumors have periodically surfaced of the texts changing hands among collectors of occult materials or being used by new groups attempting to continue the great work begun in Covington's Hollow. While most such rumors have proven baseless, the possibility remains that somewhere, the knowledge compiled by Daniel Covington and his followers continues to corrupt minds and inspire new atrocities. So if you find yourself passing through the small towns of rural Mississippi and come upon a patch of unclaimed, undeveloped land in the center of a community, consider that some spaces remain empty for good reason, some histories are deliberately forgotten, and some works once begun are not easily ended. What if the darkness unearthed in Covington's Hollow was merely one tendril of a much larger evil spreading throughout America? Would you sleep soundly knowing that while one branch was severed, the root continues to thrive in shadow? The execution of Reverend Thaddeus Blackwood, Harold Covington, and George Sullivan on April 12, 1901, was meant to close the chapter on one of Mississippi's most horrific crimes. More than 500 spectators gathered outside the Oxford Courthouse to witness justice being served, many traveling from neighboring states to see firsthand the men who had perpetrated such unimaginable evil. "I came to see the devil die," Clara Hartfield told a reporter from the Memphis Commercial Appeal. The 57-year-old grandmother had traveled 60 miles by wagon. "I needed to know with my own eyes that these monsters were gone from this earth." But while the architects of the Covington's Hollow atrocities had met their earthly justice, troubling questions remained. Special Investigator Harlan Reeves, whose methodical work had brought the cult to justice, found himself unable to consider the case truly closed. In personal correspondence with District Attorney William Harrison, dated May 3, 1901, Reeves expressed his lingering concerns. "The matter of the sister circles mentioned repeatedly in the recovered texts continues to disturb my sleep. If, as these writings suggest, Covington's Hollow was but one node in a larger network, then our work is far from complete. Most troubling are the repeated references to the shepherd, who apparently guided multiple groups from some central location. The identity of this figure remains unknown, as does the full extent of this network." Reeves's concerns would prove prescient. In October 1902, a fire destroyed an abandoned farmhouse 10 miles outside Meridian, Mississippi. When workers cleared the charred remains, they discovered a hidden cellar containing ritualistic implements strikingly similar to those found in Covington's Hollow, along with journals referencing the Great Work and the Ascension. Most disturbing was an entry dated February 1901, nearly 6 months after the initial discovery in Covington's Hollow, indicating continued activity, even as the trial was underway. Over the next decade, similar discoveries emerged across the southern states. In 1904, a drought in northern Alabama revealed a mass grave containing the remains of 9 children near the foundations of a church that had been abandoned in 1898. In 1907, renovation work on a courthouse in Shreveport, Louisiana, uncovered a sealed chamber bearing ritual markings consistent with those found in Covington's Hollow. Each discovery bore the same hallmarks: hidden chambers, ritualistic implements, and texts referencing the Ascension and 49 vessels. Yet despite these connections, law enforcement struggled to identify living perpetrators. In most cases, the primary suspects, usually respected community figures, were found dead under suspicious circumstances shortly before investigators could make arrests. It appears that following the Covington's Hollow exposure, the remaining members of this network took extraordinary measures to erase their connections, Reeves wrote in his 1910 report to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which had recently begun coordinating efforts to investigate these linked cases. In each instance, we find evidence of hasty abandonment, followed by apparent suicides of key suspects, though I harbor serious doubts about the voluntary nature of these deaths. Reeves's investigation took a personal toll. His obsession with uncovering the full extent of the network strained his marriage and health. By 1912, he had been officially removed from the case, though he continued his work unofficially, traveling at his own expense to investigate new leads. His private journals from this period reveal increasing paranoia, though perhaps justified. "I am being watched," he wrote in November 1913. "Twice this week, I observed the same man following me in Jackson. When confronted, he vanished into the crowd. My mail shows signs of tampering. Eleanor urges me to abandon this pursuit, but how can I when I know children's lives hang in the balance?" In January 1914, Reeves disappeared while investigating a lead in New Orleans. His body was discovered 3 days later in a hotel room, an apparent suicide by pistol. The official report noted that he had left a rambling letter speaking of shadows closing in and claiming he could no longer bear the weight of knowledge. His wife, Eleanor, however, vehemently rejected the suicide ruling. "My husband was murdered," she told the Jackson Clarion-Ledger. Harlan never owned a pistol of the type found with his body. He had received a telegram claiming to have information about the Shepherd and went to New Orleans full of purpose, not despair. They silenced him because he was getting too close to the truth. The investigation effectively stalled following Reeves's death. World War I soon diverted national attention and resources, and by the time peace returned, the Covington's Hollow case had faded from public consciousness, becoming little more than a macabre footnote in criminal history. Yet every few decades, new evidence emerges suggesting that what began in that Mississippi church continues to cast long shadows. In 1938, a private collector purchased a set of leather-bound journals at an estate sale in Chicago that were later identified as some of the missing texts from the Covington's Hollow evidence room. These texts contained detailed instructions for rituals, including architectural plans for the hidden chambers and specific astronomical alignments to be observed. Most disturbing was the discovery, in 1957, of a hidden room beneath an abandoned church in rural Kentucky containing newspaper clippings about the Covington's Hollow case alongside fresh ritual implements, and a journal with entries dated as recently as 1955. This suggested not just continuation of the original network, but active recruitment of new members carrying the work forward. Professor Martin Gladwell of Miskatonic University, who has studied these cases extensively, published his conclusions in his 1978 work, Shadows of Faith, Occult Networks in American Religious History. What began in Covington's Hollow appears to have been not an isolated cult, but rather part of an organized effort that predates the Civil War. Evidence suggests Daniel Covington encountered these beliefs during his travels in Europe in the 1850s, particularly in certain remote regions of Eastern Europe, where similar practices had existed for centuries. The great work referenced in their texts appears to be a misguided attempt to achieve immortality through ritual sacrifice, based on a corrupt interpretation of both Christian doctrine and older pagan traditions. The belief that the essence of children, viewed as pure vessels, could somehow be harvested to fuel this transformation is a perversion found in multiple occult traditions throughout history. Most concerning is evidence suggesting that this network adapted, rather than disbanded, following the Covington's Hollow exposure. They became more cautious, more distributed, and potentially more dangerous. The referenced figure of the Shepherd remains unidentified, though evidence suggests this individual may have held a significant position in either government or clergy, providing protection and coordination for the various circles. In 1982, construction workers in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, uncovered a sealed basement beneath a building that had once served as an orphanage in the early 20th century. Inside were the remains of 11 children, alongside ritual implements and texts bearing striking similarities to those found in Covington's Hollow. Carbon dating placed these deaths between 1925 and 1940, decades after the original case had been closed. FBI Special Agent Diana Mercer, who led the investigation into the Baton Rouge discovery, noted in her report, "The methodology has evolved, but the underlying pattern remains consistent with the Covington's Hollow case. We see the same references to vessels, the Ascension, and the 49 souls." What's particularly disturbing is how this group has managed to operate undetected for so long, adapting to increased law enforcement scrutiny while maintaining their core practices. The most recent confirmed connection came in 2011, when a flash flood in northern Mississippi uncovered a previously unknown cavern system containing clear evidence of ritual activity, including an altar identical in design to that found in Covington's Hollow. Carved into the wall was the phrase that had appeared in the original cult's texts: "The great work continues." Carbon dating of organic material found at the site suggested it had been actively used as recently as 2008. What began as a shocking discovery during church renovations in 1900 has revealed itself to be merely the surface of a deeper, darker current running through American history. The full extent of this network, whether it constitutes one continuous organization or several groups drawing inspiration from the same source, remains unknown. Equally uncertain is whether the modern inheritors of this tradition continue to pursue the original goal of the Ascension, or whether the purpose has evolved over time. What seems clear from the evidence is that the belief system first documented in Covington's Hollow has shown remarkable resilience, adapting and surviving despite exposure. Law enforcement agencies maintain open files on these connected cases, though they rarely discuss them publicly. Occasional disappearances of children in small towns across the southern United States still trigger quiet investigations into possible cult connections, particularly when they occur near historical sites with links to the original case. For the communities touched by these horrors, the legacy is one of silence and lingering fear. Covington's Hollow itself no longer exists as a town. The remaining residents voted to dissolve the community and change its name in 1910, hoping to escape the shadow of what had occurred there. Today it appears on maps as Westfield, a quiet farming community whose residents are largely unaware of what once transpired on their soil. The site where the First Baptist Church once stood remains undeveloped, a conspicuous empty lot in the center of town that locals describe vaguely as not suitable for building. Few remember why this prime piece of real estate has remained vacant for over a century, but something in their collective memory warns against disturbing that ground. As for the victims, those identified and the many more suspected but never confirmed, their stories largely faded from public memory as the decades passed. The 17 children whose remains were found in the church walls were reinterred in a memorial cemetery in Oxford, marked by a simple monument reading, "Innocents of Covington's Hollow. Rest in peace at last." Yet peace may be the one thing these souls cannot find, for as the evidence suggests, the work that claimed their lives did not end with their discovery. Somewhere, perhaps in another small town with a respected church and upstanding citizens above suspicion, new chambers may be under construction, new rituals performed, new vessels prepared. So if you find yourself driving through the back roads of Mississippi or Louisiana and come upon a town that seems just a little too perfect, where the church stands a little too prominently, where strangers are welcomed with smiles that don't quite reach the eyes, perhaps it would be wise to continue on your journey without stopping. For the great work continues, and not all of its servants have been called to account. The shadows grow long across America, and in those shadows old beliefs persist. The cult of Covington's Hollow was never truly destroyed, merely pruned, allowing new growth to flourish in darkness. And somewhere perhaps the shepherd still guides his flock toward that terrible ascension, 49 souls at a time.